Well, let's get the view now of the Adam Smith Institute, which promotes free market ideas. I'm joined by David Pryor from the Institute. I'm so sorry, I said David. I mean Daniel Pryor from the Institute. Daniel, thanks very much for being with us this evening. There's a lot to talk about here. Rising cost of living. We've already heard, obviously, about the gas prices in the immediate. We've heard there about the council tax, potential council tax rises in the slightly more medium term. Let's start with energy bills and sort of a general point about cost of living. Iceland boss Richard Walker earlier today said that higher energy bills and other costs mean that price rises are now inevitable. Of course, that's because businesses don't benefit from a price cap on gas. Supermarkets may resist as long as they can from raising prices because they are highly competitive. But in the end, they are going to have to pass these costs on to consumers, as are other industries, aren't they? Like paper, like ceramics.
Yeah, the fact is that many businesses are just going to pass on some of these necessary higher wage costs to consumers by hiking their prices. You mentioned supermarkets. Does anyone really think that a £30 an hour wage for broccoli pickers, for example, as we've seen in some parts of the country, is sustainable? How is that going to affect farmers or what each of us pays in the supermarket? And we've seen recently at the Conservative Party conference this kind of grand plan for restricting the labour supply and boosting wages. That might mean that they go up in some sectors, but without any change in productivity, some of that resulting inflation is going to eat away at any real wage gains. And without those productivity changes, you risk this quite worrying cycle of a wage hike followed by a price hike and a lot of the economic disruption that comes from some of that. So it's not going to be a good situation. It doesn't seem, at least from our perspective, like the government's really got a credible plan to tackle it.
Well, Boris Johnson went hard on productivity. He said he wanted the UK to become a productive nation once again, that it wasn't going to rely on foreign workers. It was going to train up its own workers to become productive again. You're not convinced by that?
No, I'm not. It was classic Boris in terms of getting the audience on board. There's no doubt he's a very good public speaker, but I'm not interested in whether he can crack a good joke. The most frustrating part of this for me was him concocting this narrative of, well, shortages and low migration means we're going to get high wages and high productivity down the line. Well, you can't shrink your way to prosperity. More than anything, this is just simply economically illiterate, almost incredibly so for a party that prides itself as being a safe pair of hands on the economy. I mean, underlying all of this, the elephant in the room is that there's no evidence EU free movement, for example, had a significant impact on wages across the board. There's pretty good consensus on the economic literature in that point. But the story that Boris seems to be telling here is that, say, a business that used to rely on cheap migrant labour will be deprived of it now. So they'll respond by boosting productivity and investing. This really just isn't feasible in some sectors. It's quite hard to significantly boost productivity for people who work in fruit picking, for example. So, as I said, the likely scenario for this is that we're just going to see it passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. That's not a road to prosperity, to high wages, without any real measures taken to try and boost productivity. All we're going to be getting is kind of bluster when it comes to this speech that he's done.
We know that these inflationary pressures on the whole economy and, of course, now trickling down to consumers are across the board. They're growing. You know, we're seeing it in food, we're seeing it in gas, we're seeing it, you know, slowly rising across the board. The Conservative government might say, well, we've lived through a once-in-a-generation pandemic, COVID. What were we supposed to do? How far back do you think the roots of these sorts of inflationary pressures go? Can we take them all the way back to 2008?
I think it's certainly true that a lot of these inflationary pressures aren't within the control of the government. But what is in control is how they respond to this and how they respond to maintaining the post-COVID recovery more generally. I mean, again, Boris in his speech invoked Thatcher to argue that the Conservative Party should hike taxes. And in order to do so, they want to try and repair the damage caused by the pandemic to public finances. But of course, we're in the midst of a fragile economic recovery. We're enjoying very low borrowing costs, historically low borrowing costs, in fact. And the kind of approach they seem to be taking, it's not just bad for workers and businesses around the country, it's going to risk Labour replacing the Tories as the party of low taxes. I saw polling a few days ago that suggests that may already be the case in terms of who voters trust to keep taxes low for people like them. They should be focusing on policies that encourage growth, and instead they're presiding over the highest tax burden in a generation. Now, they've tried to kind of focus, at least in rhetorical terms, on housing reform. But again, you've got encouraging words and you dig down into the actual policy, and there seems to be a complete rowback in terms of what they were planning on doing. So there's very little that I can look at in the agenda they've set out over the past few days at conference that inspires me to think, okay, they really do have a plan to boost our economy and make sure that this recovery lasts and to mitigate the effects of inflation. In fact, they seem to be embracing it.
Yeah, well, on another day when we've got more time, I'd love to ask you what proposals the Adam Smith Institute would be putting forward, because that'd be absolutely fascinating to know. Daniel Pryor from the Adam Smith Institute, thanks so much for your time.